Today's mindful moment. What if the biggest conflicts of the 21st century, what if they aren't about resources or ideologies like we often hear? What if it's something much deeper, like civilizations clashing?
Yeah, that's the big provocative question, right, that Samuel P. Huntington poses
Right.
in his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. And
It's a big one.
yeah, we're diving deep into, his arguments, exploring why they've sparked so much debate.
Right. They're controversial, to say the least.
Definitely controversial. And we're gonna, try to see what it all means for you.
Yeah, for us, for everyone, right? I mean, this book, it throws a wrench into how we normally think about global politics.
It really does. He's arguing that it's not just about countries, like going at it for power,
Right.
but these larger cultural entities, these civilizations that are clashing.
Right. So we're talking about something bigger than just like whose interests
Yeah.
or what political ideology.
For sure. He defines a civilization as like it's the broadest level of cultural identity, right? It goes beyond just language or nationality even.
Yeah.
It includes values they share, history, their traditions, religious traditions, and even how people see themselves in the world, right? Think about it like this. One person might identify as Italian, Catholic, European, and Western.
Right.
But it's that Western identity that ultimately shapes, how they see the world, how they see everything.
Their whole worldview.
Their worldview, yeah, and aligns them with a particular civilization.
Okay, so civilizations are like these big cultural groups that influence how people understand the world.
Precisely. And what makes this so interesting is that his definition, it isn't just about objective characteristics.
Right.
It's also this sense of how they identify themselves. People choose how strongly they feel about being part of a certain civilization, and it can change over time too.
That makes sense, yeah.
People change, so.
Yeah, so that means, civilizations aren't like these fixed things. They're always evolving as people, redefine themselves and their relationship to these groups.
Okay, so civilizations can change. They're fluid.
Right.
That makes sense. But why do they clash?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
He says that the end of the Cold War, instead of leading to this harmonious world, it actually like unleashed all these cultural forces that were just kind of bubbling under the surface.
Right.
He saw the Cold War's focus on ideology as kind of a distraction from these deeper cultural differences, right?
Right. So we were so focused on communism versus capitalism that we missed these fundamental cultural divides.
Exactly.
And he identifies three main drivers of these clashes between civilizations. So first he points to modernization and social change.
Okay.
As people are, taken away from their traditional ways of life by globalization and, technology, rapid technology changes, they often turn to religion for stability, for meaning.
Yeah.
This can lead to religious identity becoming stronger, and in some cases to fundamentalism even.
Okay, so religion becomes this powerful source of identity when the world's changing so fast.
Yeah, exactly. And this ties into the second driver of conflict, globalization itself.
Oh, wow.
Right. So you have more interaction between civilizations, which, a lot of people see it as a force for peace and understanding, but it can also, make people more aware of their differences. Imagine, for example, how people would react differently to, let's say, investment from the West versus a country from the Middle East, even if it's the same amount of money. You have those historical and cultural associations, and they shape how people see things.
Right. So globalization brings us closer together, but also makes us more aware of our differences.
Precisely. And this leads us to the third driver, which is the West's declining influence on the world stage. He argued that as other civilizations are, rising in power, think of China, for example, they're going to challenge the West's dominance, and that's going to lead to more tension and potentially conflict.
So basically a shift in the global balance of power combined with these cultural differences kind of creates this this recipe for clashes between civilizations.
That's the core of his argument, yeah. And he believes that these clashes, they're going to be most intense along what he calls the fault lines between civilizations.
And fault lines, okay.
Yeah, the points where different cultures, meet and interact.
Okay, and which fault line did he think was the most volatile?
He was particularly worried about the fault line between Islam and the West.
Islam and the West. Okay, why that one in particular?
Well, he points to centuries of baggage,
right?
Going all the way back to the Crusades to colonialism,
right?
That have fueled this mistrust and this animosity between these two civilizations. And he argues that these historical tensions, they're made worse by what's happening today.
Yeah.
Terrorism, who controls the oil, migration patterns, and just different views on human rights.
Okay, so it's not just these theoretical cultural differences. It's real issues happening.
Yeah, real world issues, historical events that make things worse.
That's right. They contribute to this sense of us versus them.
Exactly. And he introduces this really interesting concept called kin-country rallying.
Kin-country rallying, okay.
Which kind of explains how these tensions can get really bad. The idea is that countries, they tend to support other countries that share their civilizational identity, even if it means, overlooking some of the things they do.
Oh, interesting.
Think about the Yugoslav wars back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So the West, which is mostly Christian, they supported, Croatia and Slovenia, while Russia, with its Orthodox Christian background, they backed Serbia. These alignments were driven by these cultural and religious ties that went beyond just politics or strategy.
Okay, so kin-country rallying adds this whole other layer to these conflicts.
Right.
It's not just countries acting in their own self-interest.
Yeah.
It's about these cultural and religious loyalties that are influencing what they do on the world stage.
Exactly. And this raises a really important question, right? How do we handle these complex cultural dynamics in a world that's getting more and more interconnected?
Yeah, it's a huge question. It makes me think about, speaking of different perspectives, I was looking at this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments.
Oh, interesting.
And it uses AI to analyze audiobooks.
Wow.
And explore how different cultures understand and interpret the same stories.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's like a window into these different cultural mindsets.
Yeah. It's amazing how technology can, help us bridge these cultural divides and understand different perspectives.
Right. But even with tools like that, I think the challenge is still there. Like how do we go beyond just recognizing that there are these cultural differences and actually start building real understanding and cooperation between civilizations?
That's the $1 million question, right? And to answer that, I think we need to, go deeper into Huntington's arguments and look at some of the critiques of his work.
Right. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
So stay tuned because we're just getting started.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about Huntington's idea of kin-country rallying and how those cultural and religious, ties, they can really shape global politics.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept, but it also kind of makes you wonder if Huntington might be oversimplifying things a little, right?
That's a big criticism, of his work. A lot of people say he paints civilizations with too broad a brush, treats them as these like monolithic blocks when in reality they're super diverse.
It's like saying all Westerners believe this or all Muslims think that. It's just not that simple, is it?
Exactly. Critics, they point out that there's a whole spectrum, right, of beliefs and values within any civilization.
Right.
And to essentialize whole groups, it's not just inaccurate, but it can be, kind of dangerous.
Right, because it reinforces stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly.
And it ignores the common ground that might exist between people from different cultures.
For sure. So while recognizing, those broad cultural differences, it might be helpful, but it's important not to just assume that everyone within a civilization thinks or acts the same way.
Right. Absolutely. And that leads to another major critique of Huntington's work, which is his focus on the West's declining influence.
Yeah.
He argues that as the West's power kind of fades away, other civilizations will just naturally rise up to challenge it. potentially leading to conflict. But is that really accurate?
That's where things get debated. Critics, they say that the global system, it's way more complex than just a zero-sum game, right?
Yeah.
Like they suggest that there's room for multiple centers of power to coexist and maybe even cooperate.
So instead of one civilization dominating, you could have a multipolar world where different civilizations are working together.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Think about China. It's this major economic and military power, but it hasn't really followed the path that Huntington predicted.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's engaged with the global system on its own terms, blending elements of Western capitalism with its own unique political and cultural traditions.
So China's rise kind of challenges Huntington's assumption that modernization always leads to adopting Western values and institutions.
Exactly. And this speaks to a bigger debate about universal civilization, this idea that Huntington really criticizes.
Right. Can you explain that a little bit? What does he mean by universal civilization?
Well, he says there's this assumption, especially among Western elites, that Western values and institutions, things like democracy, individual liberty, free markets, that they're just universally applicable and desirable.
Wow.
He calls this the Davos culture.
Right.
After the World Economic Forum, where all these global leaders get together and they all supposedly share these beliefs.
Yeah.
But Huntington, he argues that this Davos culture, it's far from universal.
Right.
He thinks that outside the West, maybe 1% of the population actually shares these values.
Wow. 1%. That's really small.
Yeah. So who gets to decide what's civilized or universal? You know, it's a very loaded term.
Right.
And that's the heart of it, right? His point is that this idea of universal civilization, it's often used to justify Western dominance, and the imposition of Western values on other cultures.
Right, which of course can backfire and create resentment instead of creating real understanding and cooperation.
Exactly. Now another interesting thing that Huntington talks about is language.
Okay.
He says that while English is like the dominant language, for global communication,
right,
this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is becoming Westernized.
Right.
He compares it to, adopting the Christian calendar
Okay.
or Arabic numerals.
Right.
These are widely used systems, but they haven't erased those cultural differences.
Right. So just because people are using English to talk to each other doesn't mean they're abandoning their own cultures or adopting Western values.
Exactly. It's more about, practicality, right?
Yeah.
The need for a common language in this globalized world.
It's like I can enjoy a Bollywood movie without suddenly becoming Indian.
Exactly. You can have separate spheres of influence. People can adopt certain, tools or technologies without fundamentally changing who they are.
Right. Okay, so this raises an important question though. How do different civilizations respond to this challenge of modernization?
He identifies three main approaches: rejection, bandwagoning, and reform.
Okay, let's break those down. Rejection, that sounds pretty straightforward. Just resist anything from outside and stick to the traditional ways.
Right. But Huntington argues that this approach, it's just not going to work in the long run in a globalized world.
Yeah.
Societies that try to completely isolate themselves, they're probably going to fall behind economically and technologically.
Right. So rejection isn't a viable long-term strategy.
Not according to Huntington, no. Then you have bandwagoning, which is the opposite.
Okay, so bandwagoning means like fully embracing Western culture and trying to become part of the West.
Yeah, exactly. He points to Turkey under Ataturk as like a prime example.
Right.
Ataturk, he implemented all these, big reforms aimed at secularizing and westernizing Turkish society.
Right, but even Turkey, despite those efforts to kind of join the West, they've still had problems fully integrating, right?
That's right, and it highlights how complex this whole bandwagoning approach is, right?
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just adopting, Western institutions or ways of life. There are deeper cultural and historical factors at play.
Right. Okay, so that leaves us with reform. What does that look like?
Reform is about finding that middle ground.
Right.
It's about modernizing, but still keeping your own core values and culture.
So it's like taking the best of both worlds, right?
Yeah,
Modern technology, modern ideas, but adapting them to your own cultural context.
exactly, exactly. He points to Japan as a successful example of this approach.
Oh,
Japan, modernized really fast in the late 19th, early 20th centuries,
yeah.
but it did it in a way that held on to its unique cultural identity.
Right, right. It seems this idea of reform is really relevant today,
Mhm.
as more and more countries are dealing with globalization and development.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's about finding that balance, right,
Yeah.
between tradition and progress, taking the good parts of modernization without losing your cultural heritage.
Yeah, yeah. Now one area where Huntington's work has been, especially controversial is his discussion of religion.
Right.
He
Yeah.
argues that the resurgence of religion, especially in non-Western societies, is a really powerful force that's shaping global politics.
Yeah.
He sees it as a reaction against Western secularism and a kind of reassertion of traditional values.
Right, right. But again, critics they question if he's, oversimplifying things.
Yeah.
Are all religious revivals like anti-Western?
Yeah.
Are they all driven by the same motivations?
Right. It's complicated, and it's
Yeah.
important to avoid those big generalizations.
For sure. And
Yeah.
and it's key to remember that these religious revivals, they're happening in different contexts, right? And taking different forms. There's no one explanation that fits all of them.
Right, right. Okay, so speaking of religion and conflict, Huntington spends a lot of time in his book talking about the relationship between Islam and the West.
Yeah, he argues that this is the most volatile, fault line in the world.
Right.
It's marked by this long history of conflict
Yeah.
and current, flashpoints.
Right.
He points to things like the growing population in the Muslim world,
Hmm.
the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, and the West's, continued involvement in countries that are majority Muslim as all contributing to the tensions.
Right.
And he says that these tensions, they're fueled by fundamental differences in values and how people see the world.
Okay, but isn't this where some of the strongest critiques of his work come in?
You're absolutely right. Critics have accused Huntington of Islamophobia,
Right.
saying that he portrays Islam as inherently hostile to to the West and,
Yep.
and ignores all the different views within the Muslim world.
Right. It's a sensitive topic, and
Yeah.
it's crucial to avoid, essentializing whole religions or cultures.
Absolutely, and it's important to remember that Huntington's book, it was written in a specific historical context, right?
Right.
In the aftermath of the Cold War, when everyone was kind of anxious about what new conflicts might emerge.
Right. Like the world was trying to figure out what the new global order was going to look like.
Yeah.
And Huntington offered his take on it, which is, thought-provoking, but it's also been, subject to some valid criticism.
Exactly. So while his work is helpful for understanding how culture and civilization play a role in global politics, it's super important to be critical of it, right?
Yeah.
To recognize its limitations and to consider other perspectives.
Right. Okay, so where do we go from here? What are some of the possible scenarios for the future, and what role can individuals play in shaping that future?
That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. So stay tuned as we dig into what Huntington's work means and think about what it all means for the 21st century.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, looking at both the insights it gives us and the controversies around it.
Yeah, it's a book that makes us think about some tough questions about culture, identity, and the potential for conflict in this globalized world we live in.
Right. We've seen how Huntington argues that civilizations are these like fundamental building blocks of culture that shape how people see the world, and how those differences, they can lead to clashes, especially as the West's dominance globally starts to decline.
Yeah, and we've also we've talked about the criticisms of his work, the worries that it oversimplifies things, essentializes things, and maybe even has a bias against certain cultures, particularly Islam.
Right. So with all that in mind, let's get to what might be the most important question. What does Huntington's work tell us about the future?
Well, Huntington himself, he he paints a kind of pessimistic picture, He sees a world that's becoming more and more divided along civilizational lines, and he thinks there's a chance for big conflicts to break out along those fault lines.
So he doesn't see globalization as this force for bringing people together.
He gets that globalization connects us, but he argues that it also makes us more aware of our differences, and that can actually make tensions worse, especially when those differences are, rooted in these really deep cultural or religious beliefs.
So in a way, globalization brings us closer, but also shows us what separates us.
Exactly. And as those differences become clearer, the chance for conflict goes up, especially when you add in shifting power dynamics and competition for resources.
Okay, so if Huntington is right, are we headed for some kind of huge clash of civilizations? Is that the only way this can go?
Not necessarily. While Huntington focuses on the potential for conflict, he also asserts that there are things working against it.
Like what? What are those?
Well, for one thing, there's the interdependence that globalization creates.
Okay.
Countries are so connected economically and through things like environmental problems
Yeah.
that it encourages them to cooperate, even if they have, big cultural differences.
Right. Like even if we don't agree on everything, we're all in this together. So we have to find ways to work together to solve these problems.
Exactly. And then there's the fact that civilizations aren't, these single unit, like Huntington sometimes makes them seem there's a lot of diversity within civilizations, and that diversity can create chances for dialogue, for understanding, and for cooperation, across those cultural boundaries.
So it's not just the West versus Islam or the East versus the West. It's more complicated than that.
Way more complicated. And I think that's where the real value of Huntington's work is,
Okay.
It makes us think hard about the role of culture and civilization in global politics, but it's on us to go beyond those simple interpretations and really engage with those complexities.
Right. So even if we don't agree with everything Huntington says, his work reminds us that culture matters, that these deeper differences can really affect how things play out on the world stage.
Absolutely. And it's a call to look beyond just the surface level stuff, the political or economic factors, and to really try to understand those deeper cultural things going on.
Okay. And what about us as individuals? It can feel pretty overwhelming when we're talking about these massive forces like civilizations, does what we do even matter?
That's a really important question. I would say that what individuals do and the choices they make are more important now than ever. In a world where information is everywhere and cultures are always bumping into each other.
Right.
We can choose to just go with the stereotypes and build walls, or we can choose to question what we think we know, to engage with different perspectives, and to build bridges instead. And that starts with, being informed, with understanding how complex this world is, shaped by both the things we share and the things that make us different. It's about, looking for different perspectives and having those thoughtful conversations, even when they're, kind of uncomfortable.
Right. And it's about realizing that we're all part of this interconnected world, whether we like it or not. And that what we do, even the small things, they have an impact.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for how we interact with other cultures and understanding that building a more peaceful and understanding world, it takes effort from all of us.
That's a powerful thought. It's not just about countries and civilizations clashing. It's about the choices that each of us make every day.
And those choices, they matter. They really do shape the world around us.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the clash of civilizations, haven't we? We've looked at Huntington's main arguments. We've talked about the debates around his work, and we've considered what it all means for what's to come.
We've tackled some big questions about culture, identity, power, and the possibility of conflict in this globalized world.
And we hope this deep dive has, made you curious, made you question some of your own assumptions, and given you a new way of looking at how complicated global politics really is.
Remember, even if you don't agree with everything Huntington says, his work makes us think about these really important questions about how culture shapes our world. If
you're interested in learning more, we've put links to Huntington's book and some other resources in the show notes.
And we really want to hear what you think. What stood out to you? What questions are you still thinking about? Share your thoughts and be part of the conversation.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep. be sure to check out Mindful Moments.
It's the perfect way to just add a little bit of wonder and wisdom into your everyday life.
Subscribe, share with your friends, and purchase via the link provided. You won't